Hello, welcome to this video about troubleshooting a Rolleiflex 2.8f light meter. Unfortunately, it's getting more and more common when you find these cameras that the meter's not functioning, and it can be hard to find someone who's willing to work on it. Parts are increasingly less available, but the good news is there are a few things that you can do to test the light meter and see if you can figure out which part of it's not working, so you can find replacement parts, or you may even be able to get it up and running. When I got this one, it was not functioning at all, and was able to get it back working properly. The metering system in these is pretty straightforward. There's a selenium cell back behind this nameplate here. It's light sensitive. When it's exposed to light, it puts out a voltage. The more light it receives, the higher the voltage. There's two wires that run across this, back behind this nameplate, down through the body and out into the meter here. And the 2.8f, which we have here, has a coupled light meter. Now you can get a light meter in 2.8e, 2.8f, 3.5e, and 3.5f models. Some of those don't have them, but a lot of them do. What it means to say that the F version is coupled is, you see here, as we change the aperture and as we change the shutter speed, the indicator over here moves. So it's pretty easy to set your exposure because you point your camera at the light source, and then all you have to do is move the dial until it aligns with the needle, and there you go, you have your exposure. So because of that, there's a few things that we'll need to do specific to this camera before we dig into this. But ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to test the meter itself to see if it's working. We're going to test to make sure that there's continuity between here and here. And we'll test the selenium cell. And usually what you'll find is that you can isolate what's not working. And like I said, maybe even fix it. So first thing we're going to do is dig into the meter. Now to do all this, all you're really going to need is a screwdriver, paper clip, a sewing needle will also work. We'll see in a minute what that's for, and a multimeter. So to get the meter out of the body, we first have to set a few things. First of all, this filter compensation dial needs to be set to 0. Our film speed, press this in and turn. And that needs to be set to 12. Our aperture needs to be f22, and our shutter speed needs to be 500th of a second. So 0, 12, 22, 500. Because this meter is coupled, it has to be set to this, otherwise when you put it back in, it's not going to respond properly. So removing the meter is pretty simple. It's just these two screws right here. And that's what the meter is like. A few things I'll point out here. The first is, this here is the positive pole. This here is the negative. These can get dirty, just get things built up on them over the years. So sometimes it's simply a matter of cleaning these and suddenly your meter's working again. To clean them, I suggest just a regular old eraser. It's good enough to polish up those contacts, but not damage anything. So if you pull this out and those look dirty, clean them off with an eraser. That may solve your problem. Another thing I want to point out is this little screw right here. these have to be calibrated over time. And what that screw will do, watch the needle as I turn it, is move that needle. And that needle should align perfectly with this little red line that you see here. That way you know it's calibrated perfectly. So, first thing we're going to do is test this and see if this is even working at all. Now, of course, I already know that this one is working, but when I got this camera, it was not responsive to light at all. To do this, we'll use the multimeter. Now, the selenium cell in this thing puts out a pretty low voltage, so we know that this thing will respond to a low voltage. So what we'll do is set the multimeter to check resistance to the ohms symbol there. And what that's going to do is it'll put out a slight voltage when we test this. So in theory, if this thing is working, when we go to test the resistance, it should respond. So if we touch these here together, you'll see it does. So that's a good sign. That shows us that this meter is indeed actually working. Now, if you get nothing when you do that, it's probably a pretty safe bet that this part is dead, which is no good, but it will at least give you direction as to what parts you might be able to find out there to replace. Or if you find a used one on the market somewhere, you can use this to test it and see if it's working and figure out if that will fix your problem or not. So let's say our meter's working just fine, but when we screw it back into the camera, we're still not getting anything. What next? The next thing to test is right inside here. So as you can see, up here is a gold-plated contact, and then over here is another gold-plated contact. That's the positive, that's the negative. And that aligns with positive, negative. So what we're going to do, again using the multimeter, is check and see if there's any voltage coming through. So to do that, you want to point the camera at a light source, of course, so that if this is working, it will be responding. And then we'll do essentially the same thing that we just did with the meter. Touch one to the positive, one to the negative. And sorry. There you go. As you can see, it's hard for me to touch these properly, but we are getting voltage there, and it does change as I move it around the light. So that's a good sign, because what that is telling us is that between here and here, there is voltage coming through. So on this particular camera, it wasn't working, but I tested this and the meter was working. I tested this and there was voltage getting through, but whenever I would plug it in, it wasn't working properly. So what I was able to figure out is, in the case of this meter, a second here. These contacts that I pointed out earlier, I suppose just from people cleaning it over the years, had been bent back into the camera body. So the meter was not actually making contact with those contacts. I was able to remove this side of the body, get to those contacts, bend them back into place, and then it worked again. I'm not going to show you how to remove this side for a couple reasons. One, you can mess up a lot that way, But also there's another video out there that does a good job of showing that, so I'll put a link to that in the description here. So let's say that you've tested your meter and it's working. But then let's say you tested the voltage here and there's no voltage coming through. Well, then what we need to do is figure out, well, is that because there's some problem in the connection between here and here? Or is it because this selenium cell is actually dead? To do that, we'll need to test this cell. So the first thing we'll have to do is remove this nameplate. To do that, these little bumps you see here hold the diffuser, but they're also screws. If you look real close, you can see, I don't know if I'm doing a very good job showing this. There we go. See right there? There's a little hole in the side of both of these posts. Now with the paper clip or the sewing needle, if you wish, you can stick that right through those, like so, and they turn. And I just tightened that one. Not what we're going for. So, same thing over here. You can loosen them up to the point that you can unscrew them by hand. I've already cheated a little bit and loosened these before I started recording, so they may be a little tougher to unscrew the first time you do it. Here's what those look like. Whoops, where you can see them. So that's what those screws look like. Put them over here out of the way. Now with that, this nameplate comes right off. So on the back of this, screwed in here, and is the selenium cell. Now there should be another screw there, but apparently someone's lost this one at some point. There's no need to remove this from this. We can test it just like it is, but you'll see there are two gold-plated contacts over here, and those align with the gold-plated contacts on the body. So now what we're going to do is test and see if the cell itself is still working. So again, we'll test the voltage. To do that, we're simply going to put one on the positive, one on the negative, and then kind of bend it around so that it's exposed to different levels of light. And you'll see that as the light goes up and as the light goes down, the voltage reading changes. So that's a good sign. That tells us that this is indeed responding to light. So now we've been able to test the meter and see if it's properly functioning. We've been able to test the continuity from here to the focusing knob to make sure that it's getting voltage. We've been able to test the selenium cell itself and make sure that it is putting out voltage. Now, of course, they all work in this case because we know the meter on this camera is working. But if you have a non-functional meter and you're not sure what's wrong, this will help you isolate it. I'll also point out that in addition to cleaning these contacts that we talked about on the meter itself, I have seen them where there's corrosion on these contacts and they also need to be cleaned off, and simply cleaning that makes the proper connection on these pins and it works again. So If you test the meter and it's not working, you probably need to find a new meter. If you test the selenium cell and it's not putting out any voltage, probably need to replace that. But what if this reads properly? Or excuse me, what if this puts out voltage properly? And what if this is working? Then what? Well, most likely then there's some sort of problem with the connection between these pins here and these contacts here. And that can get pretty difficult to figure out. Back behind this plate, which I'm not going to take off, are simply two wires. They're soldered on. The wires run back here, down through the body, out through here, like I said. And behind each of these contacts, the wires are also soldered on. So it's possible there could be some corrosion built up on those, creating some resistance. It's possible that those contacts may have come loose and need to be resoldered. But if you're feeling brave, you can dig into that. Another thing that we can do to test is we can put the meter back in. And now remember, we've put the meter back in with the compensation set to 0, film speed to 12, the aperture at f/22, shutter speed at 500th of a second. Test and make sure everything still looks like it's working properly. And it's going the full range, and it is. So the other thing we can do is, just like we tested the meter itself for resistance, we can put the meter in the body and then test for resistance from these contacts here. That bottom one is positive, the top one is negative. You can see when I do that, that the meter needle moves. Oops. So that tells us that there's definitely communication between here and here. So again, just another way to test and make sure that we know for sure which part's working and which part isn't. That pretty much covers it. There's not anything else more complex in there about the meter. You can occasionally online find selenium cells for sale from people who've parted out cameras. You can find meters for sale, same thing. Now you have an idea of how you can test them and make sure that they work. Now you have an idea of how you can figure out which part most likely needs to be replaced. The value of these cameras seems to be pretty heavily impacted by a functional meter also. So being able to clean these contacts, clean the contacts inside, or simply replace one part and get the meter working again can add some value to the camera. So hopefully this has been useful for you to get this back on. Pretty straightforward. Again, while we have all this apart, I would recommend just going ahead and cleaning those contacts. That fits right back on there. These screws go back in place. You can tighten them back down with your sewing needle or with your paper clip, just like you did before. I'll do that later. So hopefully this has been useful. If there's anything you feel like I left out or didn't cover, feel free to ask me about it. If you are able to get your meter working again by checking these things out, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.